Hi, this is Professor Favors. This is the lecture for American literature. This is an overview of all of the different periods, themes, some historical context, as well as ideals and core values of the period. Again, this lecture is going to introduce specific literary periods, those themes that were inherent within the periods, specific authors under each of the literary periods, and then those ideals. There's the American ideal. There is the literary expression ideal. So this is an overview of the lecture. This lecture is subject to fair use, so I am using and referring to specific literary periods, authors, etc. So it is subject to commentary, criticism, research, teaching, and scholarship. So let's look at the periods of American literature just in outline form. So there's the pre-colonization. We have the colonial and early national period. This is between the 17th century and early 19th century. 17th century means 1600 to 1699. Then we have the Romantic period, which is 1830 to 1870. Realism and Nationalism, 1870 to 1910. The Modernist period, 1910 to 1945. And then, of course, the Contemporary period, 1945 to the present. Remember, there's a difference between the dates for the literary periods versus historical periods. So if you were taking a history class, the periods, the date ranges might change a little bit, not too much. So understand that literary history, in terms of periods, and regular historical periods will differ by a few years. So here's a quick historical note. The American Civil War happens during the Romantic period in terms of the literary period, and that's between April 12th, 1861 and April 9th, 1865. And then the Emancipation Proclamation is signed on January 1, 1863. So here are some of the traditional themes that you will find in this course, explored within this course within the literary works. So there's this idea of loss of innocence and coming of age. You'll see this in certain literary works. There's also the concept of survival of the fittest. The American dream sort of comes later, but there is alienation and isolation that comes right before it. Then we have political and societal rankings. So as some of the colonists came to America, they still maintain sort of like their social hierarchies. And so you will see that explored within the works, as well as during slavery, of course, you had hierarchy between master and slave. Then we have literary works that explored the author's relationship with nature or the author's relationship with science. Later, in terms of somewhere at the end of the modernist period to the contemporary period, we read of Black experiences. Then there's this push for gender and sexuality, and then, of course, freedom of expression. So these are your traditional themes that are explored within the literary works within this class. All right, so here's your modernist period, 1910 to 1945, and we have some historical notes, three of them. So World War I, July 28, 1914 to November 11, 1918, and that's of course your global conflict between the Allies and Central Powers. You can do more research on that on your own. Then we have the Great Depression, 1929 to 1939. I couldn't find exact dates, but of course, if you took a history class, you could find the exact dates. But every time I look for Great Depression period dates, I get that date range, that year range. And then World War II ended, so September 1, 1939 to September 2, 1945. Why is it important to take note of these uh, uh, um, historical periods as they relate to the literary modernist period. Well, you'll see that in the writings, the authors are very, very disillusioned. Although there's advances in science and technology, and there's a sense of rapid progress, the period is still characterized by devastation. So the devastation of World War One, leading to the Great Depression, and then we have modernism as a radical break from the past. And the past usually inspired, which inspired a lack of faith in traditional beliefs and social structure. So whatever structure we had faith in, what we believe to be our core values, there's a radical break from it now. And then this period is marked by a sense of disillusionment, even though this is considered the most productive period in American literature. Um, this period is emphasized by the nihilistic, destructive impulse compared to hope and the prospect of change. And of course, it is a period marked with contradiction. So, although there's progress, science, technology, progress, there's emotional and psychological, maybe spiritual regress. So, the modernist period authors 1910 to 1945. There's your F. Scott Fitzgerald. This is where I believe the American dream sort of comes to play, but is skewed. So the American dream might have come to play prior to this, and now is actually a skewing of it. Richard Wright attacks American racism. So now we are um, the modernist period is focused more on the impact of racism, and racism may have got its coining during this period. Zora Neale Hurston, Their Eyes Were Watching God, uh, focus on a black woman's three marriages. Ernest Hemingway is really discussing the disillusionment of the lost generation. So now we are referencing our generations. There was a generation lost prior to this, or a generation lost after it. William Faulkner, he tends to use stream of consciousness. John Steinbeck, he looks at the lives of migrant workers. Langston Hughes, he portrays the working class black life, but without stereotypes. So we have moved out of the slave representations within the literary works to now working class black life. And then E. E. Cummings is looking at a fictionalized account of his French captivity. So the modernist period inspired or contributed to disillusionment, which further encouraged the fiction writing. So when you write from a place of nonfiction, there's a lot more vulnerability. You are writing from the first person, I, me, my, right? When you write from a place of fiction, you are writing from almost a a personal distance. Like you give, you would give the person character name, and you write from that perspective. So there must have been some safety in the modernist period to write from a fiction perspective, because whatever was going on during this time might have been too much, um, too emotionally and psychologically exhaustive. I mean, exhausting and draining. So let's look at the analysis of everything we've just gone through. So understanding the author's purpose for writing. So here are your key ideas. Just a quick summation. Authors consider themselves as outsiders. They write from this perspective. For example, Emily Dickinson lives as an unmarried woman, writing in seclusion and isolation, while Walt Whitman lived as a vagabond in search of community. American literary tradition is a derivative. American literary tradition derives much of its sentiment from British literary tradition or English literature. The first colonists and publication companies modeled writing on what was published overseas in Great Britain. They wrote about their experiences beginning in the 1600s. Technological improvements increased print publication. The first transcontinental railroad aided in creating a culture of print, which further expanded the boundaries of American literature. This further inspired the perpetuation of the literary movement. Okay. Last of the key ideas, definition of literary culture assumes a larger role in global politics. This suggests an inclusive discussion about how America is depicted in novels, short stories, fictional works, and poetry. However, F.O. Matheson's work titled The American Renaissance points out the neglected voices of women, African Americans, and Native Americans. So that means there's a contradiction. There's a movement from exclusive to inclusive, but you still have people feeling neglected, meaning that they still feel like that they are excluded. Advocate, Advocacy for the abolitionist movement creates a solution for the neglected voices. So the Romantic period creates a space, an urgent need to pursue new voices and rapid change. Freedom of expression is indicated in Whitman and Dickinson's changes to American poetry from patriotic and historical to free verse that lacks the inhibitors of rhyme and meter, which is mostly characterized in English literature. So there's a movement from heavy dependence on English literature or British literature to now uh, more freedom um, in American literature. Change inspires new voices and new freedoms. Various authors write using different American dialects, but also inspire divisions into different periods, values, sentiments, and belief systems from the perspective of writing and literature. Initial exclusive nature of writing transitions to rejection of ideals to expressions of freedom. So that rejection of ideals is the status quo, whatever the status quo at that time. So if the writings uh, um, advocated for maintaining slavery, which would be the status quo, then new writings or new literary authors reject those ideals, those core values, and say, no, we need to push for abolition. So that means the writing is going to express freedom. All right. So this is the end of the lecture, and these are the sources consulted. This particular PowerPoint will be uploaded to the classroom as well as my website too. Thank you very much for listening.